Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. This is chapter 5 of the 6 chapter series all about project management for non-project managers. If you haven't checked out the previous chapters, then first link in the description will take you to an entire playlist of all the 6 chapters so that you can check out the previous chapters and then come back here on chapter 5. That being clear, that being said, let's get started. So, chapter 5 is all about planning, scheduling, and budgeting. As you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover in this chapter. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, to begin with, these three, planning, scheduling, and budgeting, they all require estimation. You need to estimate them, and estimation is actually an art. Estimation is not a science. It is an art that you as a project manager need to master. So why do we call it an art? The reason for that is simple. It is the sheer amount of unknowns that you need to deal with while doing an estimation. So some of the examples of unknowns are details might change. What details you have today may change tomorrow. Issues may occur. Things happen, and I should have put in an exclamation mark here. So things happen, and that's why estimating beforehand is always an art. But there are several tools and techniques that you can make use of, and those tools and techniques is all that we are going to discuss as part of this chapter. So you can use these tools and techniques, and that way you can overcome these problems of uncertainty. So in step 1 in this chapter, let's look at the tools that you are going to use. Starting off with work breakdown structure, which is popularly known as WBS. So WBS, what it does, it helps in breaking down large chunks of work into individual tasks. So if you have a large chunk of work, can you break it down into individual tasks so that it becomes more manageable, right? So you can do this, and to do this, you need to first of all brainstorm with the team to chalk down all the deliverables. What are the documents? What are the sub products you need to create to deliver the end product of the project, right? You need to understand all the deliverables that your project is going to produce. Also, you need to understand the tasks that your project need to perform, right? Your project team need to perform a lot of tasks to be able to complete the project, to be able to deliver the project, right? So what you can do is you can use post-its to come up with the list of deliverables as well as the tasks. After this, you can again meet with your team, and you need to ensure that every post-it represents a task and not a group of tasks. Remember, what we are trying to do is we are trying to basically divide this large chunk of work into smaller manageable pieces. So you need to make sure that these post-its that you have created by brainstorming in the uh, first step of this entire process of creating the WBS, these post-its should represent one task and not a group of tasks. So if required, you can break the post-it item further down. So if you realize that a certain post-it actually is referring to a group of tasks and not just one task, then you can break that post-it item further down. Finally, what you need to do is you need to arrange these tasks in groups of major areas of activity. So you need to find which of these are familiar tasks, and then you can arrange them in groups of major activities. Second tool that you can use after work breakdown structure is the project logic diagram. So what is this logic diagram all about? So this diagram is basically about arranging the post-its that you have created here. These post-its in a logical sequence, you need to arrange it to create the logical diagram. So the post-its that you created in step 1, making use of the work breakdown structure technique, now you need to arrange them logically. So what do we mean by arranging these post-its logically, right? So when you are actually arranging them logically, you might be able to find a few tasks that may have dependencies or can be performed in parallel. This is also a right time to estimate the time required for each task. So basically, you have got your post-its from step 1, technique 1, which was work breakdown structure. Now in technique 2, you are actually arranging these post-its logically. What do we mean by logically? Which post-it should come first, which should come second, which should come after it? You are arranging these post-its in that manner. And when you do so, that's when you will realize that there are certain post-its which have dependencies on other post-its, and there are certain post-its which can be performed parallel. Remember, these post-its are nothing but tasks, right? So let's talk about these two, dependent tasks and parallel tasks. Dependent tasks are basically some activities that are dependent on other activities. For example, it is not a good idea to start building a bridge before you have designed it, right? So you need the design activity, the design task to be complete before you can start building that bridge, right? So every task related to design, right, the entire design activity should be complete before you can start off with tasks that are related to activities of actual construction. Second type of tasks are parallel tasks, right? So we talked about how when you arrange those post-its logically, you may find that some tasks have dependencies and some tasks can be performed in parallel. We just talked about dependent tasks. Now let's talk about parallel tasks. So parallel tasks are basically the tasks which are not dependent on the completion of anything else and may be done at any point in time. So these are parallel tasks. They are not dependent on anything. You can perform them in parallel as well. The longest string of tasks. So you are arranging these tasks in the logical diagram, right? So the longest string that you're going to see is also known as critical path. And we will talk about critical path in more detail in the next slide. So let's head there. All right, let's continue our discussion on the tools and the techniques that you can use for planning, scheduling, and budgeting. Till now, we've already discussed the work breakdown structure. We've already discussed the project logic diagram. We already have divided the large chunks of work into smaller manageable pieces. Those pieces are basically tasks. Those tasks have been grouped into familiar activities. So tasks that are familiar to each other, they have been basically grouped into activities. When you have tasks in hand, that's the best time to also estimate the amount of time required to complete a task. So with that in mind, let's talk about critical path. And we have touched upon the critical path in the previous slide as well. Critical path is basically the longest string of tasks. So if you add durations of all the tasks on all the paths, the one with the highest duration is the critical path. So these string of post-its, right? If you add durations of all the paths, right? All those strings, if you add durations of all the paths, the one with the highest duration is going to be the critical path. Let me give you an example so that you can understand this in a better way. Before that, the most important aspect of critical path is the fact that a delay in any of the tasks on the critical path is going to delay the entire project. How does this work out? Let's take a look at this example. So all these letters A, B, C, all these letters basically represent tasks, right? This is where you start the project. This is where you end the project. The number that you see on top of all these tasks, these can be your post-its also, right? The tasks, the post-its that we created. So these can be your post-its as well. These are basically the tasks. The number that you see above these post-its, 4, 2, 6, these is basically the amount of time required to complete these tasks. So it could be 4 days, it could be 4 weeks. We have not taken any unit here as such, but you need, let's assume it is days. So you need 4 days to complete task A, right? Similarly, you need 6 days to complete task B. And these are all the paths. Remember, these tasks are basically aligned based on which ones are parallel. So C, B, E, these seems to be parallel. But can you do B before you have done A? Of course not, because the path is such that once you're done with A, only then you will go to B, only then you can also go to C. That means B and C are parallel tasks, but A and B are dependent tasks. B is dependent on A. So that's how a diagram is basically drawn, and how you find, this is the logic diagram of course, and how you find the critical path is you are going to add the duration of all the paths. So the first path you have is A, then B, and then end, right? So A, it takes 4 days, B takes 6 days. So total duration of this path is 10 days. Then you have A, C, F, G, and then end. So A, C, F, G is 4, 2, 3, 4, which means 13. And this is also the critical path because this is the highest number of days, the highest duration. And we talked about how the highest duration is the critical path, right? There is third path as well, which is D, E, H, and then end. So D, E, H is 3, 5, 1, which means 9. So ACFG is the critical path. Remember, if there is a delay in this path, ACFG, this is what we talked about in the second point, right? The fact that a delay in any of the tasks on the critical path is going to delay the entire project. I hope you see the point here. Let's say this F is delayed, then obviously your critical path is delayed. You were taking 13 days to complete the project because other tasks would have been performed in parallel. But if F, task F turned from 3 to 5, then your critical path time frame changed from 13 to 15. So that is why activities on critical path, they are also known as critical activities, and rightly so, because you cannot afford a delay in critical activities or the activities on the critical path or the tasks on the critical path, right? I hope critical path was clear. Let's move on to the next tool that you can use for estimation. So after discussing the work breakdown structure, the project logic diagram, and the critical path, the fourth and the final tool that you need to be aware of for your planning, scheduling, and budgeting is Gantt charts. Now, you might have already heard about Gantt charts because they are quite popular. Some people even think that all that a project manager does is create Gantt charts. Now, we are on chapter 5 of this series, and I'm pretty sure you would have realized by now that there is a lot of other things that a project manager needs to do, not just create Gantt charts. But Gantt charts, creating it is definitely something a project manager does. So Gantt charts, they help plan the tasks involved in the project. They give a basis for scheduling, so they prepare a ground for you to come up with the schedule of your project. They allow you to allocate the necessary resources. They help plot the critical path for a project where it must be completed by a particular date. So if you have any schedule related dependencies, Gantt charts are going to help you plot those critical paths that are required. In order to create a Gantt chart, you can make use of the logic diagram, which we have already discussed in the previous slide. So you can use the logic diagram for information like estimated time required, tasks that can run in parallel or have dependencies. Remember, we talked about parallel tasks, we talked about dependent tasks. We've also estimated the time required, right? So when you have already made use of the tools that we have discussed previously, you can come here and make use of the Gantt chart. Let's take a look at a sample Gantt chart in the next slide. So this is a Gantt chart, a sample Gantt chart. What it says is, first of all, you will start off with the market research activity. As you can see, this is a dependent activity. This is not something that you can do in parallel. So you start at August 16, you complete your market research by August 30. That's your estimate. Once you're done with market research, that's when you are going to define specifications or come up with requirements. So define specification is actually a dependent activity. Unless you're done with market research, you cannot start off with defining specifications or coming up with requirements. Then you have overall architecture. So that's also something which is dependent on the previous two activities. You need to have specifications defined before you can start off with the architecture. Remember, you have dates here as well. You are giving 2 weeks for all three activities till now, but project planning is not a dependent activity. Halfway through designing the architecture, you can start off with the project planning as well. And halfway through project planning, you can start off with the detailed design of your project. Halfway through the detailed design, you can start off with software development. Software development is the actual work that you're doing as part of this project. So you don't have any parallel tasks for the first 3 weeks of software development, but starting the fourth week, you are also beginning to plan your tests, and then after that, you start off with testing and QA. When you are in the last week of development, you are in the last week of planning tests. That's when you are starting off with testing and quality assurance as well. While you're doing testing in the last 2 weeks, you are also creating user documentation. So this is how all the project activities are charted out in a Gantt chart. I hope the example was clear. Let's move on. Okay, before we talk about step 2 in planning, scheduling, and budgeting, I'd like to let you know about a certification known as PMP. If you don't already know, this is the gold standard, the most popular professional certification in the world of project management. And over at pmclounge.com, we believe that you can clear this certification in 50 days. If you need a study plan, you can go over to pmclounge.com/pmp study plan. This study plan is absolutely free. It tells you what you need to do in 50 days to clear the certification. Okay, let's move on to step 2 of planning, scheduling, and budgeting. And this step is all about scheduling. When scheduling, you should understand the concept of non-aggressive timelines. Now, does this sound counterintuitive to you? Non-aggressive timelines? Shouldn't you, as a project manager, be making sure everything is done as soon as possible? No, not really. You shouldn't rush through the project. That's something as a project manager you need to understand. So if you as a project manager are not familiar with the individual tasks, right? Individual tasks that you need to carry out on the project, there is a high chance of not understanding the amount of time required for completing the project, right? So that is why as a project manager, it is very important that you have certain amount of domain experience, certain amount of technical knowledge as well. You should be able to understand the individual tasks that you would need to carry out as part of the project, and you should also be able to understand and estimate the time required to carry out those individual tasks. Add to that, there is another risk, which is about accounting for unexpected events or unscheduled high priority work. An unscheduled high priority work may show up at any point in time of your project, and it may totally derail the schedule of your project. I hope you're now seeing the point why it is important to design a project schedule which is non-aggressive when it comes to timelines. So you should not be over optimistic or over enthusiastic, and you should not unnecessarily plan aggressive timelines. Instead, you should make use of your experience in the domain of project management, in the domain of the project that you're dealing with, to chalk out a project schedule. So when coming up with the project schedule, don't be aggressive. That's the bottom line of this slide. Moving on. So let's talk about some of the important factors that you need to keep in mind when you are coming up with the project schedule. First one is detailed project plan listing out all the project activities. So you should have a view of the project plan that enlists all the project activities. So here you can make use of all the tools that we talked about, the work breakdown structure, the critical path, the logic diagram, all that. Make use of all those tools and have a view of all the activities that are required to be done as part of your project. Having this view of all the activities is going to help you come up and estimate the project, right? Come up with a good estimate that is non-aggressive, that is achievable. Time requirements of stakeholders, contractors, and all other parties. So let's say you want to procure something as part of your project. If you're constructing a bridge, you will have hundreds of things that you need to procure from contractors, right? So you need to also consider the time that contractors are going to take. If you have other stakeholders, let's say construction of the bridge involves government as well. Government is a stakeholder. Are you taking in account the time that government authorities will require to whatever that you need for from them as part of your project, right? So you need to take in account that time as well. Recruitment, training, and other such KT, knowledge transfer activities. If you need to recruit people, if you need to train them, you need to account for this time as well when you are coming up with your project schedule. Accidents or emergencies, they can happen at any time. You should have some buffer to manage accidents or emergencies. Holidays is something that you should always take care of. If you're dealing with, let's say, people from China, they have longer holidays, right? There are certain festivals, let's say the Chinese New Year, which lasts up to a week to 10 days as well in certain cases. So you need to consider that as well when you're coming up with your project schedule. Some buffer that we have taken for accidents or emergencies, there should be some buffer for sickness among the core staff. Let's say your chief engineer, if he falls sick, right, you need to have certain buffer designed in your project schedule for things like these. Equipment breakdowns, always the case. It can always happen in any of the project, right? And most likely it happens in all the projects all the time. Procurement delays due to paperwork, transit delays, right? So we talked about how you need to speak to your contractors if you want to procure something, right? You need to speak to them and come up with a project schedule, but then there could be delays which these people have no idea about, because there could be delay due to paperwork, there could be delay due to transit as well. So those are the things your contractors are not going to tell you about in advance because they would not know, but these are the things that you need to account for when you are coming up with your project schedule. If there are any other identified risks that you know of, let's say the weather is going to go bad 2 months from now, you have seen that in the forecast, that is a risk. You can account for that in your project schedule. So I hope you understand by looking at this that project schedule is not something that you design in a silo. You need to speak with a lot of teams, you need to speak with a lot of people, you need a lot of inputs before coming up with a project schedule. Now, one thing to understand here, and that's why we talked about how your schedule should be non-aggressive. Time heals everything. I repeat, time heals everything. You see, all problems are solvable in time. So building in plenty of contingency time will give you a head start if you need to tackle unexpected hurdles. That is why always have a non-aggressive project schedule. Let's move on. Okay, step three is all about assessing the cost. So we talked about schedule. Let's talk about the cost of the project. And there are typically two types of cost. First is one-off development cost, and the second one is ongoing operating cost. So first we will just talk about the one-off development cost. These are the costs that you need to pay one time only. So human resource cost, one time only. And when I say one time, I mean one time throughout the course of your project, right? Research cost, you have to do certain research for your project. Development cost of the entire project. That's why I say it one off, right? Should also include any software, any hardware, any licenses that you need to procure. Infrastructure cost, implementation cost, that includes training, recruitment, any kind of communication, any other activities required for implementation. Then you've got third parties, contractors, external consultants if you need them. These all are one-time costs, including taxes required to be paid as part of the project. So these all are one-time development cost for your project. And the second one, like I said, when you're assessing the cost, is the ongoing operating costs. So these include overheads like general operating costs. These also include new stocks of materials resulting from the project. These also include new admin costs, let's say accounting, record keeping, you need to account for that. These are all operating costs, right? Cost incurred before the benefits of the project can be realized. So you're done with the project, but the benefits are yet to arrive. The benefit realization is yet to happen, and it is 3 months away. So the cost incurred during the time of those 3 months, that's also an ongoing operating cost. Cost of running your business day to day, like office rental, vehicles and expenses, existing staff, additional duties, all these are ongoing operating costs. So these can be called as capex, capital expenditure. These can be called as OPEX, operating expenditure. So I hope assessment of cost was clear. Now, another thing to consider here before we close this slide is the fact that the earlier on in the project you do your estimates of the cost, the more likely it is that these will only be best guesses, right? You can only guess about costs like these. You cannot come up with uh, a fixed figure, a final figure, right? So for this reason, it is essential to allow a significant contingency as well. We talked about how you should be non-aggressive in your schedule. You should have certain contingency in your cost as well. So as an absolute minimum, you should add a further 20% to what you think the costs will be, right? Unfortunately, in most cases on actual projects, the actual cost tend to be higher than whatever the project managers estimate. So that's the reality of the situation. So these are some of the costs that you need to keep in mind. These are some of the tips that you need to keep in mind while coming up with these costs. So step four is benefits identification, and we touched a bit on benefits realization in the previous slide. So let's talk about benefits identification. And to simply understand this, let me ask you a question. Which of the two below sounds like a good critical success factor for the project? A, relocate the house by the end of the month, or B, relocate the house as quick as possible. So which of these two is a good critical success factor for your project? Your project is to relocate the house. So what do you think is a good critical success factor? End of the month or as quick as possible? End of the month clearly defines a date. You need to complete this project by end of the month, while as quick as possible is open to interpretation. Nobody knows what as quick as possible really mean, right? So benefits that your project offers must be measurable, either financially or in other quantifiable terms. This is very important, right? Why is this important? Because first of all, when you go to your decision makers to get your project approved, they will also ask for the benefits. What are the benefits to approve a project? Why should we invest in this project, right? So they need to do their assessment, and for that you need to understand and know what the benefits are for your project. Also, if you have identified the benefits, that's how you are going to assess whether your project was a success or not. If those benefits are realized, then of course your project was a success. But if those benefits are not realized, then project was actually a failure. So to get your project approved by the decision makers and to be able to assess later whether the project was a success or not, you need to clearly define the benefits that your project is going to offer. Step 5, the final step in planning, scheduling, and budgeting is all about estimates revision. Remember, we talked about non-aggressive timelines when it comes to schedule. We also talked about how you should have some buffer when it comes to budgets, and that's where estimates revision come into the picture. So even the best project managers out there, they cannot estimate the project cost upfront. That's the reality of the situation. We talked about the OPEX and the CAPEX. Nobody can estimate them upfront 100% correct, right? So you have to start somewhere, or else the sponsor wouldn't approve the project in the first place. So you basically do a start, you come up with certain number, but obviously it is understood that nobody can come up with an exact cost upfront in the starting of the project itself. So when you kick off the project with an estimate in mind, it is important for the project sponsor as well as other stakeholders to understand that the estimates are subject to revision. Project sponsor is the most important stakeholder of your project. Project sponsor is the person who is financing the project. So it is important that your sponsor understands the fact that the numbers you are giving him in the beginning of the project are subject to revision, because no project manager on Mother Earth can come up with exact cost of the project up front. So what are these revisions when we say subject to revisions? What are these revisions? Let's take a look at that in the next slide. So these are the revisions that you should have in mind. When you start off your project, you have a ballpark figure. That figure is plus 50% to minus 30%. So you go to the sponsor, you go to the decision makers, you give them your project cost, but it is subject to be changed by plus 50% to minus 30%. This is the range in which that ballpark figure can fluctuate. Next, when you start off with your project design, you come up with another number which is, more closer to reality, and that is also subject to a fluctuation in the range of plus 35% to minus 20%. When you are implementing your project, then that fluctuation range comes down to plus 20% to minus 10%. And finally, around the time of the project launch, the number that you are going to give to your sponsor and the decision making stakeholders, that number should fluctuate in the range of plus 10% to minus 5%, right? So this is just the leeway, just the buffer that you as a project manager will have in his hands, right? When you quote a number to a sponsor or other decision making stakeholders in the beginning of the project, they need to understand that that number can fluctuate in the range of plus 50% to minus 30%, right? And that is also why it is important to give them the benefits that you hope to realize as part of the project, right? Because the number that you're giving can fluctuate in a very large range, right? And one other thing to understand here is that these figures, right, these ranges that we have shown here are not necessarily mandatory for every project, for every industry, for every organization. They may have their own ranges as well. This is just something you can start working with if you don't have any range in sight. But you as a project manager in your organization should try and find out what range of fluctuations is allowed in cost before coming up with the cost estimates for your project. Okay, so let's look at some of the quick wins for this chapter. Use appropriate planning tools. We talked about all the tools. Use appropriate ones. Do not overcomplicate a simple project by bringing in unnecessary tools, right? So if it is a smaller project, it doesn't really require a project logic sequence diagram, then don't create one and don't overcomplicate a simple project as well. Project timelines must be non-aggressive. We talked about how important this really is. Cost estimates must include project costs as well as any one-off costs, the capex and the opex that we talked about. Quantify the project benefits as much as possible. You need to give and speak in numbers when you want to get your project accepted, when you want to get your project approved by the decision making authorities, when you want the sponsor to invest in your project. He or she should be able to see quantifiable benefits coming out of the project. Finally, refine the estimates for accuracy, and you need to defend those estimates as well. You need to make sure that everyone, all important stakeholders, understand the fact that estimates are going to be refined, and they should also understand the range in which it is going to fluctuate. So that was all that you need to know when it comes to planning, scheduling, and budgeting. We are done with chapter 5. The next chapter, which is the last chapter in this series, is all about managing risks. You can click the link on your screen right now or the first link in the description below, which is a playlist of all 6 chapters. See you there.